cases, you're not allowed to go to the mosque until you have a university degree. How do they police these things? I gave a story last time I was here of one sister who's of a different ethnic group in China. We'll talk briefly about it. There are 59 ethnic groups in China, but the three that we're going to be talking about are the Han, that's the dominant group, they're the dominant race. The second are the Hui. There are about 10 million people in China who identify as Hui, and that's where when we typically think of Chinese Muslims, those are the Hui Muslims, not really the Uyghurs. And then you have the Uyghurs in Xinjiang who are Turkic. They're not Chinese. They don't speak Chinese. They've never seen themselves as being Chinese, and that's the primary problem that the People's Republic of China has with them. So there's all these regulations. Long story short, she wanted to leave, so she was able to get a passport for herself, for her husband, and for her youngest child, and she was 7 months pregnant. So they left, and they went to Istanbul, Turkey. The plan was for her husband to go back into China, Xinjiang, to get passports for her other kids, and they're all going to leave, and they're going to live outside of Xinjiang. They're going to live outside of Western China. When I say Xinjiang, this is where the Uyghurs live. It's the Western Autonomous Region. This is where most of the Uyghur people are. So when they left, they're in Istanbul. Her husband goes back, and he was arrested. They said that he went overseas to engage in terrorist activity, and then her other kids who were staying with her husband's family, who they all had a business in Urumqi, in the capital of Xinjiang, they were all arrested. And then when she tried to contact her sister on the phone, her sister's phone was cut off. She was completely cut off from all of her family members. She was left in Istanbul with her one child who was already a couple years old, and then she had given birth to her youngest son, and she named him Muhammad, because in Western China, if you name your child by the first name that's not a Chinese name, you're considered an extremist. So she named her child Muhammad, but then what happened is she had no contact with any of her other family members. And she can't go back into China because she doesn't know if she's going to be arrested and put into one of these camps. So she's just waiting to see what could happen. And then finally somebody shared with her an image from a Chinese propaganda video of children in an orphanage. And she immediately recognized her youngest daughter, Aisha, right here. And they put her daughter in an orphanage. This is what's happening, is that so many people have been rounded up. What happens to the children? The children are being taken and they're being put into schools like we have in the United States, child separation. This is the same thing. These orphanages are oftentimes overcrowded. They're not really taking care of the kids. And they're trying to get rid of all vestiges of Uyghur culture from them. They don't want them to identify as Uyghur. They don't want them to speak the Uyghur language. So this is something that's happening. It's heart-wrenching to think about this, that the only memory, the only connection that you have with your daughter is from a government propaganda video, and other than that, you're completely cut off. So this is a popular image of the concentration camps that many of us have seen, that it looks like something from a dystopian film almost, where you have everybody who's all dressed the same. They're not able to grow their beards because that's considered a sign of extremism. And when they go into these camps, the purpose of it, that China says, is vocational training. They say they're going to give them job training, they're going to give them language training because they want them to be able to speak Chinese. But what's happening here is that they're actually trying to make people denounce religion. It sounds unbelievable that they would do this, but they force people to drink alcohol in these camps. They force them to eat pork in these camps. They force them to sing patriotic songs all day long. You have to sing according to some people who've come out, you have to sing 3 patriotic songs before you can even eat breakfast. And then they also have them engage in what we call self-criticism sessions. In China, they call it a struggle session. We'll talk about that more. These things, they sound so strange, but to sum it all up, it's basically psychological torture. So concentration camps, we've heard about that. Child separation, I just spoke to you. This is something that is becoming a bigger issue nowadays. If you watch a Vice documentary that was just published, I believe it was last week, they go through China, they are posing as tourist bloggers, and they go to these different locations where you can see it from satellite images, where these colorful buildings have popped up all over the Xinjiang region. And what these colorful buildings are is their orphanages, where they're taking all the children of the people who've been put in the concentration camps, and they're forcing them to live in these kindergartens or orphanages. And then you also have intensive surveillance. Some of us have heard about this. There was actually a report yesterday in The Intercept and also today about how you have IBM and you have Google. Google, a few months ago, they had something called Project Dragonfly, where they were trying to help China increase its search capabilities, and they're working with China building its internet. And people were so upset about that. People in Google, they protested and they were forced to pull out. So now Google executives, they've partnered with IBM executives and they started a different organization, and they're helping China create intensive surveillance to the extent they're able to use facial recognition technology so that if a person is going through the train station in Xinjiang, they're able to follow them continuously from one building to the next without having a single instant where they're not being watched. If you go to the Grand Bazaar in Xinjiang, there are surveillance cameras every few meters, so you're never out of view outside of a camera. They also have at every single major intersection, there's either a police station or a checkpoint. And when you look at these police stations and checkpoints, documentary crews who've gone in there are huge lines of Uyghur people, elderly people who have to get checked. And the Han Chinese, the dominant race, they just get waved through because there's a racial element to this discrimination. And then finally, we have a totalitarian system of control. For those of us who don't know what totalitarian system of control means, it means that there is no limit to the government's authority. This was best summed up by Benito Mussolini, the head of the fascist party in Italy in World War II, who said, "Everything inside the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state." There is no limit to state control. In China, especially in the 1960s and 1970s, you had really the apex of the totalitarian system, where the government, they care about what you believe. The government cares about how you act in your home. The government cares about everything that you do, and it's all under the control and purview of the government. And then on top of this, we have total silence from Muslim nations. Even though you have 2 million Muslims rounded up, we're precariously close to, at least, I mean, it is a cultural genocide, not really a genocide of people dying yet. Actually, we might not even know because it's a closed society and you don't know exactly what's happening in these camps. But you have total silence. Just a few months ago, you had the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia who went there and he said, "I fully, completely support China's ability to fight terrorism." And we're going to talk about how China came to buy into this kind of language about terrorism. "I fully support China's ability to fight terrorism in their own country." And he said nothing against what was happening to the Uyghurs. You had the Prime Minister in Pakistan, Imran Khan, who had said that he comments on Kashmir. He's commented famously about drone strikes in Afghanistan. He's made brave statements to bring these things to light. But when he was asked about the Uyghurs, he said, "There's not really a whole lot in the newspapers, so I don't know much about it." You have the Iranian leadership who's oftentimes very vocal about Muslim issues, but the fact is they haven't said anything about Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And one of the reasons for that, actually the reasons for all three of these people, is because of Chinese investments in the Middle East. We're going to learn about, there's something called the Belt and Road Initiative that China is engaging in. There are huge investments from China in the Middle East, but specifically with Iran right now and the sanctions, the only country that's buying Iranian oil is China, so they said absolutely nothing. In the early 2000s, or in the late 90s, you had the former leader of Iran, Mohammad Khatami, who went to China and he spoke and he actually voiced, "We'd like to have a special relationship with the Uyghurs in Western China." And that was something that caused a little bit of suspicion from the Chinese government. They didn't like that because they don't want the Uyghurs to have any connection with people outside. On the other hand, we have silence from Muslims, but you have very loud statements by these people, and that's really surprising. It should kind of raise an eyebrow that you have the same people in the Trump administration who are calling for Muslim bans. You have the same people in the Trump administration who are the biggest Islamophobes in this country. But then on the other hand, they're saying that they defend Muslim rights in Western China. You also have Mark Rubio, who, although he has not come on board with the Trump administration and their policies against Muslims in this country as vociferously as these other two have, he has still supported it. And he is the one who has also introduced a bill in the Uyghur Human Rights Act of 2019 into Congress right now. It's in the Foreign Relations Committee, and that would establish some ways to help the Uyghurs. But these people are all supporting Uyghur rights. They're very loud about it, along with, if you go ahead and you look, the Chatham House, the Rand Corporation, some of the same people who, if you've been paying attention, you lived through the war in Iraq, again, it would kind of make you wonder, why are these people so outspoken for Uyghur rights? But then, at least in the case of some of these politicians, when it comes to Muslim rights in other countries, they're completely silent. As a matter of fact, they are downright Islamophobic. So that's something we're also going to look at. So how did we get here? when it comes to the history of China, what are we talking about with the Uyghurs and how did it come to this point? When you look at documentaries that have been produced about the Uyghurs, they often go back to the 1990s. They often go back to 2009 when you had riots in Xinjiang that kind of led to what we have today. But I want to go back a little bit further, not in too much detail. When were the Uyghurs, when did they become Muslim? There are always these Turkic-speaking people who lived in Central Asia, and they became Muslim about 1,000 years ago. And they've thoroughly had Islamic culture in their blood, in their ethnicity, to the extent that if you go ahead and you look at USSR, former Soviet republics, what happened after the USSR fell is that a lot of these nations, they're so invested in Islam that right away they were able to come back and Islam spread amongst the youth. It's the same thing with the Uyghurs, that we see periods in their history where China tightens control over them and they're not able to express Islam, but as soon as that becomes released a little bit, people always come back because they've been Muslim for over 1,000 years. They were sometimes incorporated in Chinese empires, and they were sometimes left to their own autonomy to have their own empires. But in 1911 to 1948, and this is something that it's really kind of sad. I teach history, or I used to teach history in schools here in the United States, and we learn American history in 5th grade. We learn American history in 8th grade. You learn American history again when you're a junior in high school. And then for some people, they'll even learn it again when they're in their first years in college. They have to take American history. But we don't really learn anything about other countries' history in too much detail. I took AP history classes. Probably all I have known about China is that Mao Zedong was a communist leader. And that's Mao right there in a propaganda poster up top leading the Communist Party, to victory. What's also interesting about this poster is you see, if you look closely, there are people of all different races. It looks like a person of African descent right here. There's somebody wearing a turban in the back. There's all different kinds of people in this because when he came to power and he struggled throughout the early 1900s to bring China onto the Chinese Communist Party, he made a lot of promises to other people. So did Vladimir Lenin in the USSR. As a matter of fact, how do we get the Uthmani copy of the Quran Sharif, the copy that Sayyidina Uthman was reading when he was murdered, that was taken by the Russians from Turkey, and Lenin, as a goodwill gesture, for those of you who don't know, he was the leader of communism in Russia during the revolution, he took that copy and he sent it back to the Muslims in Uzbekistan to say, we're not going to oppress you, etc., etc. A lot of those promises, they ended up falling apart shortly after these leaders took power, unfortunately. So during this time period, 1911 to 1948, a lot of us, we might not appreciate what China was going through. We might not appreciate why are there people in China, for example, who support the Communist Party. And even though despite all of their crimes, despite all the horrible things they do, if you look at China before the communists took over and you look at China now, it's like night and day. It's completely different. As a matter of fact, in the earlier period here, in the early 1900s, you had in China something called an open door policy. The open door policy was in comparison to Africa, where European nations got together and they had something called the Conference of Berlin, where they literally had a meeting and they told every single European country, France gets Algeria and they get Morocco. Germany is going to get such and such territories in Africa. England is going to get these places. They divided it all up. But when it came to China, the United States came in and we said, look, we all want to have markets to send our goods, so China will have an open door policy. Everyone will plunder China. And that's what China was going through. You had horrible crimes taking place all throughout China. And during this period, what was happening with the Uyghurs is they were trying to have their own autonomy. As a matter of fact, who was supporting Uyghurs in their quest for independence? It was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was giving them weapons and military training, and they were helping them to fight against the so-called Republicans in China, Chiang Kai-shek, who eventually that became the leadership of Taiwan. That's why there is this beef between Taiwan and mainland China. So the Soviets were helping the Uyghurs, but then when it became clear that Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, that they were going to take over, the Soviets backed off. And they agreed with Mao that the Uyghurs would be incorporated into China, even though, this is really important, the Uyghurs never, ever saw themselves as Chinese. The Uyghurs never, ever wanted to be part of China, and the Uyghurs always saw themselves as having a separate nation, a separate language, a separate culture. So by 1948, it was all done. The Uyghurs were fully incorporate it into China as part of an autonomous region. Mao Zedong, he promised them that they're going to be able to make their own laws, they're going to be able to have their own autonomy, but that proved very quickly to be a hollow promise. Immediately after 1948, Mao Zedong, he said, we're going to develop the autonomous region, Xinjiang. So they started sending people there to create businesses, create infrastructure. They had something called the Great Leap Forward, but that failed. Millions of people in China starved due to mismanagement and other problems that took place. And due to the failure of the Great Leap Forward, you had a new policy in 1966 where Mao Zedong, he said that we're going to have something called the Cultural Revolution. This is what I was alluding to before when it comes to totalitarianism. And right here, what was the Cultural Revolution? They have all these slogans from the Chinese government. It was the destruction of the four olds. The destruction of the four olds. Old customs, old beliefs, old ideas, old habits. They all had to go. And the chief amongst them was religion. So you see in this image right here, this is the Panchen Lama. How many of you guys have heard of the Dalai Lama before? Dalai Lama? So the Panchen Lama, according to Tibetan Buddhism, is second only in command to the Dalai Lama. And what you have here is something that the Chinese call a struggle session. What a struggle session is when somebody has to get up and they have to criticize themselves. This is something that all of us would agree to in common sense. Like Lenin wrote about it, Mao Zedong wrote about it, that at some point in our life we're going to make mistakes, so you have to be able to admit your mistakes. But what happens when somebody does not want to admit their mistakes? China has a slogan. When they bring somebody into a police station, they tell them, those who confess receive leniency, and those who resist will receive severity. This is their slogan. It's almost like, you know, we say you're guilty until proven innocent, but if they bring you in, they know you did something wrong and you have to admit to it. And if somebody says they don't admit to those crimes, then they engage in this struggle session. So if you look closely, what you see here in this grainy photo is the Panchen Lama has his arms tied behind his back. There's all these microphones here. You can imagine for someone famous like this, there'd be a large crowd of people watching. And then all these people are around him, and they're all announcing all the crimes that he did. They're all surrounding him, getting in his face. They might even be chanting against him. And he has to admit to those crimes. And if he doesn't admit to those crimes, then he'll just be further publicly humiliated or kept into one of these re-education camps for a longer period of time, or tortured in other ways. There's something called psychological torture where they say you're crazy and they try to force to give you psychiatric medicine, or they tell people that you're insane. This also happens in the United States. There was a whistleblower in the New York Police Department in 2010, and he recorded the New York police saying that they're going to round up as many Hispanic and African American kids on one particular night so they could meet their arrest quota. And he had those recordings made. And then the police, they came to his house. They said he was suicidal. They forced him into a mental hospital. And he was there for 7 days until he was able to get out. So this is psychological torture. So another example you have here is you see these two men. Again, they have their hands tied behind their backs. They have to wear these signs that list the crimes that they committed. There's a whole crowd of people here. It could be during a political rally. And they're made to stand onto a stool, and they have to balance themselves. Another story from this was a professor who lived through the Cultural Revolution, and what the Communist Party did is they took the blackboards off of her university where she taught. They ripped them off, and they wrote with the chalk on those blackboards all the crimes that she committed. And then they made her stand on a chair, and they tied her hands in such a way, it was like a stress position where she had to balance on the chair. They called it the airplane. And then they made her stand there, and they chained the blackboard to her neck. And then they brought in all these people from the countryside, farmers who, you know, they just get bussed in. And then they all started chanting, down with so-and-so, down with so-and-so, until she admits her crimes. During this time period, you also had other incidents where the Quran was burned. You had Muslims, Hui Muslims and Uyghur Muslims, they were forced to eat pork again. You had the alcohol, they were forced to drink alcohol because they have to show that they're not extreme. Some of us might not know pork is the most commonly eaten meat in China. So if you're eating something different, they think that you're separate from us. That's a type of schism, and that's going to cause problems down the line. So they want you to eat the food that Chinese people supposedly eat. But we would recognize that now as being a type of cultural genocide, saying you can't have your culture, you have to have our culture. Imams were splashed with paint during this time period. There was something called the Shadian incident with Hui Muslims, not Uyghur Muslims. The Hui Muslims, like I said earlier, they see themselves as Chinese. And typically when we say Chinese Muslims, we mean the Hui Muslims. The Hui Muslims, interestingly enough, some of them are not sympathetic towards the Uyghur cause because they see themselves as Chinese. And if you go back in history, sometimes the Chinese Empire would use Hui Muslims to attack the Uyghur Muslims. In Xinjiang, where Hui Muslims also live, you have mosques where Hui people go and you have mosques where Uyghur people go, because there's also a language thing. We kind of have that in Southern California and everywhere else too, right? Where you have certain masjids where it's predominantly a particular racial group and other masjids where there's another racial group. So it doesn't necessarily mean there's this hard antagonism, but it happens over there. So in a Hui village, there was one imam during this time period who called for a had punishment upon a person. And when the communists heard about this, they all came into the town, they closed down the mosque, and they were very repressive towards the people there. The Hui Muslims in that town, they started getting on trains and they were going to go to Beijing to say, we're not getting our promised religious autonomy. We should be able to go to these mosques and we should be able to practice our religion, etc., etc. Eventually, the People's Liberation Army came into those villages and they started repressing those people. Those Hui Muslims, they stormed a barracks, they took weapons for themselves. This is in 1975, and they kind of staged a little bit of an uprising. And the PLA came in and they bombed from the air, they invaded from the ground, and they killed 1,000 people in that town, the Shadian incident in 1975. They massacred them. All in the name of what? Combating barbaric old ideas. They massacred 1,000 people. It doesn't make sense. That's what they did. You have the same thing now, right? Where we say we want to stop terrorism, so we're going to bomb these countries and, you know, commit acts of terror. So in that incident, interestingly enough, it tells us a little bit, how did the Cultural Revolution end? Mao Zedong died in 1976. And because he was so integral to China, the people who came after him, the Communist Party, they can't just disavow Mao Zedong. They can't just say that he did something wrong. So instead they blamed it on a group called the Gang of Four. They have these interesting names in Chinese history. You have like the 10 nations, 5 families period. You have the Gang of Four. You have the two whatevers policy. So the two whatevers policy, what this was, is the hardline Maoists, they said, we're going to follow the two whatevers. Whatever Mao Zedong did, we're going to do that. And whatever Mao Zedong told us to do, his instructions, we're going to do that as well. But instead, another person came into power at that point, and his name was Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, again, is a monumental figure in Chinese history, modern Chinese history, because he was the leader of reforms, the reformist trend in China. He said he was a Maoist, and he strictly followed Mao in some things, but other things he kind of opened up a little bit more. So during his time, after that Shadian incident where 1,000 Hui Muslims were killed, he had the Chinese Communist Party publicly apologize. They went to that town, they said, we did something wrong. They paid them reparations, they built a huge memorial inside the town, and they let the people back into the mosques, and they let them do whatever they wanted to do. They blamed all the Cultural Revolution on those 4 people, and then you had a kind of opening up of China at that time. This all came to an end in 1989. Can somebody tell me what happened in 1989 in China? You see this picture. It's not the most famous picture of this incident, but some people have to know it. I want to make sure people are listening. They know what I'm talking about here. Very good. Tiananmen Square, this is the most censored event in China up until today. People still cannot talk about this thing. People still cannot discuss what really happened at Tiananmen Square. But it also happened under this guy, Deng Xiaoping. So some people say it's a mistake to call him a reformer because he oversaw one of the bloodiest crackdowns in Chinese history. This had huge implications for the Uyghurs, also because in 1987, there's another place in China. Can anybody tell me what's the other big, I told you about Taiwan, we know about the Uyghurs. What's the other place in China where people, they want freedom? Hong Kong, that's also there. They kind of have a little bit, but there's another place they want to break away completely. Tibet. Right, when I was growing up, you know, people watch MTV, they're saying, free Tibet, free Tibet. I heard this my whole life growing up. I didn't know what Tibet was, but everybody thought it was really cool, free Tibet. So Tibet, the movement to free Tibet was also the same thing. It's kind of like a model for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And the Tibetans, they had a rebellion in 1987. So you had the Tibetans rebelling in 1987, the Chinese crushed them. You had Tiananmen Square in 1989, and this scared the Chinese Communist Party. And then in 1991, something else happened that made the Chinese Communist Party say, we have to bring everybody in tight and we can't allow any freedoms. What happened in 1991 that would make them particularly scared? It's not something in China, something having to do with global socialism, we'll say. Nobody knows? There you go. The downfall of the USSR. The USSR fell apart in 1991, so that made China become really scared that they can't have the same thing happen to them. You can't really see it here, but this western region right here in red is Xinjiang. Right here, directly below it, is Tibet. These are two large areas of China. This is as big as Alaska. It's 3 times the size of France, Xinjiang. It's a huge landmass in China. And to have these two places break off, this is the biggest threat for China, is something called regionalism. They're afraid if Tibet breaks off, then Xinjiang will break off. If Xinjiang breaks off, then Taiwan will break off. If Taiwan breaks off, maybe Hong Kong's going to seek full independence. And everything is going to fall apart. And to the credit of the Chinese Communist Party, if you want to take a sympathetic look at that, you can look at American history and European history. Every time a socialist country has tried to implement socialism, they've tried to use regionalism to break it apart. They've tried to use minorities to undermine those governments, even if they become democratically elected. So this is the thing that they worry about the most. In the left image, you see a Uyghur person arguing with a person from the Han dominant ethnic group. Because all throughout the 1990s up until 2001, the Communist Party had people living in China. They forced them to immigrate into Xinjiang. And they told them to work as farmers there. They told them to set up businesses there. Xinjiang has a booming oil business. So all the Han Chinese, because the businesses are owned by the government, all of the good jobs were given to the Han Chinese, and the Uyghurs were left out. So although the economy in Xinjiang grew exponentially, and it has a way higher GDP than it did before, the Communist Party touts this as an example of how they're helping the people in Xinjiang. But almost all those jobs are going to Han Chinese people, not the Uyghurs themselves. During this time period, you also had, like I said, farmland. They want them to go there, become farmers. They had the policy of one black, one white. The black was petrol, oil, and the white was cotton farming. And as we know from colonialism, I mentioned this during the previous talk, that in the history of India, you have a history of famines. And how did those famines occur? Because the British forced the people in India to grow certain crops that weren't native to those places, or they weren't food crops. They were just staple crops that they could sell back in Europe, like indigo and things like that. You have the similar problem in Algeria, where the Algerians were forced by the French to grow peanuts, because peanuts was a great cash crop in France at the time, but it caused the soil in Algeria to become desertification. And the people no longer have the ability to farm their land. Cotton farming was the same thing in Xinjiang. It was not a good practice for farmers in Xinjiang to grow cotton, but the government wanted them to do it because they could make a ton of money off of it. And then there's all sorts of other racial issues, like the Uyghurs weren't getting water, etc., etc. And then 9/11 happened. And 9/11 changed everything in this country. It changed everything for the Uyghurs in China as well. This is a little bit tiny here, but in the first quote you can see it says, this is from a Communist Party official in Xinjiang in March of 2001, before 9/11, just a few months before 9/11. He says, Xinjiang is better than ever in history. Society is stable and people are working and living in peace and contentment. The best it's ever been in history. And then after 9/11, I believe this is in 2003, but the party rhetoric just switched completely, where it says, China is a victim of terrorism, having long colluded with the Al-Qaeda, the East Turkestan terror organizations, perpetrated numerous terrorist attacks in China's Xinjiang and the neighboring regions of Central Asia. So now, by this point, the Chinese government went all in on the war on terror. And they totally bought into this Islamophobic rhetoric that the Muslims are terrorists and we have to defend ourselves against these terrorist Muslims. And they really weaponized it to make sure that the Uyghur separatist movement is not able to take off. 2004, you have the establishment of the World Uyghur Congress. Somebody had mentioned earlier, is there anybody that you can donate to? I'm not going to fundraise for the World Uyghur Congress because I can't say enough about them to know that that's something I would collect money for. But this is a group that represents Uyghurs in diaspora. In absence of knowing what Uyghurs actually believe inside of China, this is probably the most prominent voice for representing Uyghurs around the world. They call themselves East Turkestan. They don't actually use the name Xinjiang because Uyghurs see themselves as being a Turkic language group, not part of China, not some frontier region of China, but they say that they're part of East Turkestan, and they call for full autonomy, or independence actually, from China. They do a lot of work in Europe and the United States, and this is the most prominent organization. In 2008, you had the Beijing Olympics, and then you had a terror attack in Xinjiang, in Kashgar actually, a city in Xinjiang, where 8 people were killed in a police station because some Uyghur terrorists, they threw a bomb inside the police station and they killed some people there. And this also brought their cause to some more prominence because the Olympic Games were going on. In 2009, you had the Urumqi riots, where people, they were fighting. It was basically a race riot, where you had Uyghur people chanting through the streets, kill the Han, kill the Hui, and a lot of people died in 2009. And since then, China really accelerated their policy of cramming people in these camps. You had 2014, the Kunming train attack, where 4 Uyghur men armed with knives killed 30 people inside a crowded train station. In 2014, you also had car and knife attacks all over China. 300 people died in China in this year, and this attack, the Kunming train attack, is known as China's 9/11. You had 2018, this is the first time that China actually admitted that they had concentration camps, although they don't call them concentration camps, they call them vocational training centers. But every Uyghur person and everybody who's ever spoken to them knows nobody voluntarily goes to these camps. And in these camps, horrible things happen. 2019, now we're starting to hear about family separations, where you have people who are in these camps. We hear about massive amounts of people who are taken into the camps. You never hear about people, massive amounts being released from the camps. So what happens to their kids? Their kids are being put into camps for kids. Why is East Turkestan so valuable to China? Again, that's what Uyghur people call their nation, East Turkestan, not Xinjiang. Number one is because of natural resources. They have 21 billion tons of gas. They have 1/4 of China's coal, and they have rich farmland that the Chinese want to use for the economy. Something else is the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the biggest development project in the history of the world. China has an ambitious project to basically go over the Silk Road and to remake the Silk Road, connecting China to Europe over land in the blue lines up there, and throughout the sea, a sea route on the bottom in red that you can see. Its estimated cost, this is such a huge project, that the estimated cost ranges between $1 trillion and $8 trillion. This is a big investment across all these different nations, and this is one of the biggest reasons why these different nations are afraid to speak out against China, because there are tens of billions of dollars in investments waiting for these countries if they're able to get along. Some people have called this a type of neo-colonialism on the part of China throughout the Middle East and Asia. The last reason why East Turkestan is so valuable to China is because they can use it as an example for everyone else. The Uyghurs are a denigrated racial group within China. And if the Chinese are able to get away with putting these people down, they're able to send a message to the people in Hong Kong. They're able to send a message to all other racial groups that are not as looked down upon as the Uyghurs, and to say, if you guys mess with us, we can do this to you. We can destroy your cities. We can come down on you with a strike hard campaign, because that's what they call them when they go into Xinjiang. It basically sets an example for everyone. Number two, how does this relate to me? A lot of us, like we said, we get fatigued. We hear about all these things. This is really bad. Why should we even care about it? William Lloyd Garrison is a great American abolitionist. He said something: enslave the liberty out of one human being, and the liberties of the world are put in peril. Martin Luther King said it maybe more eloquently. He said, an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. So this is something that we should all care about. Number one, because they're human beings, and then even more than that, because we're commanded to, as Sheikh said, as Muslims, that we have to care about each other and what's happening. You have people there who are being attacked for their ethnicity, but they're also being attacked for their deen. That's really scary to think about. Imagine that we could not come to the mosque. Imagine that we're not able to go to the mosque in Ramadan. We're not even able to fast in Ramadan. That there's this much control over your life, that you can read these books, you can't read those books. It's a scary thing to think about. These people are being attacked simply so that they do not live Islam. That's something that should evoke some feelings in us. So Muslims, we typically have a few different reactions. One reaction that some people have when we hear all these things, we get the news blues. I've heard some people even recommend, don't watch the news because it just makes you feel bad. Just stay away from it and just focus on your deen, and that's what you have to do. There are other people who they take a different reaction and they get so fired up about this that these issues of human rights become the be-all, end-all of their life. And they say, why are we even praying in the mosque? Why are people doing these things? Why are they reading Quran? Why do we have madrasas? When people are dying, we should just be focusing on that. But those people, they overestimate their power in the world and they underestimate Allah Ta'ala. You have some others who they don't get depressed, but they say, look, people are being oppressed because this is a punishment from Allah Ta'ala, because we're not living as pious Muslims. So if we correct ourselves and we live as pious Muslims, then inshallah these things will go away. Those people, they forget that some of those who are being punished are children, and children are innocent, and we have a responsibility to protect those children. So it's not something that we can just put our heads in the sand and come into the mosque and forget about everybody else, and they're not even able to go to the mosque. They're not afforded that luxury. So what's the solution? Obviously, neither groups of these people are bad at all. But we have to have a balance. We have to have a combination. We have to realize that Allah Ta'ala, He made asbab. And we take those asbab, and then Allah Ta'ala does the rest. When Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam was locked in the room with Zulaykha, what did he do? He ran towards the door. He took those steps, and then Allah Ta'ala opened the door for him. And that's what we have to do, is we have to run towards the door, and we have to, Allah Ta'ala will open doors for us, inshallah Ta'ala. Something for us to reflect upon in a time like this is that we have faith and ideology. That Islam, although we have these problems all throughout the world, that Islam will always have something that is infinitely more attractive than anything, any ideology people can give. I think if you look at these two images, the one on the left of the Kaaba Musharrafa, this is something that any person in any time will be called towards. Whereas in the right, people arguing about what political party they're in, arguing about mundane things. This is not something that can solve the big questions in life. The fact of the matter is, if you take a person, if you just take, for instance, Communist Party rhetoric, that they might say, look, these children in Xinjiang, they're being fed, they're being educated. 100 years ago in China, that wasn't happening. 100 years ago in China, you had child labor, you had kids who were being exploited by landlords, you had all sorts of problems. If the kid's in the kindergarten and they're getting a good education, then what more could you ask for them? But the fact is that if you take a person and you feed him every single day of his life, and you give that person a good job, and you give that person a good home, and you give that person a nice place to live, and that person dies in that state without having known Allah, and by rejecting Allah Ta'ala, they'll live a life of sorrow for all eternity. If you think about the people the hypocrites in Medina, these people, they had wealth, they had children, they had stability inside the place where they lived. But what does Allah Ta'ala say to them? He says, don't let your wealth or your children distract you from Allah Ta'ala. Because at the end of the day, all those things are going to pass away. SubhanAllah, just last week we had somebody pass away. You had Chris Klein, who was considered to be the last coal magnate in the United States of America. This man was a billionaire. You know, if you think about the story of Qarun, he had so much wealth that they had to carry his keys on loads of camels. And when the ignorant people saw Qarun, they said, if only I had been given what Qarun was given. And the people of knowledge, Allah Ta'ala they said, what you have been given, what Allah Ta'ala sent down is better than what Qarun has. And then Qarun, he was sunk into the earth. There's a metaphor in that for us. If we think, yeah, you know, our home is not going to sink into the earth, but who can say that any one of us 100 years from now will not be sunk into the earth? All of us are going to pass away. All of us are going to lose everything. So this guy, Chris Klein, he was in the Bahamas on islands that he owned, and his daughter got sick. 22 years old, just graduated from college, a prestigious college, had 3 of her friends who had just graduated from college, and they're all in the Bahamas, and she gets sick. So then her dad gets them on the private chopper, and they're flying towards Florida to go to the hospital. So they're literally on top of the world in a sense. And we don't even know what happened. The chopper went down and they all died. The father, 22-year-old daughter, 3 of her friends, 2 pilots, all gone. In the midst of all their wealth, billions of dollars, the last big coal magnate in the United States of America. It can all come to an end. So if you reflect on these things, politics versus faith, then we figure out what really matters. This is one thing that all of us can take from whether it's Bosnia or Xinjiang or Palestine. When I was growing up, I started practicing Islam around the time of the first Intifada, or the second Intifada in Palestine at the turn of the century in 2000. And this is something that I used to speak about with my friends in high school, and that gave me a moral sense of what's right and what's wrong. And then 9/11 happened. Reflecting on these incidents is one thing people in China can't do because of the totalitarian system, lack of access to information. So this is one thing that we can do. We have to reflect on these things, the blessings that we have, the purpose in our life, and the fact that we're not just here to fill our bellies. The greatest battles in life are fought out daily in the silent chambers of the soul. So we shouldn't overestimate our ability to change things, but we put our trust in Allah Ta'ala and take the asbab. The next thing for us to consider when we're looking at Xinjiang or wherever it might be is what is true victory. Allah Ta'ala says we've granted thee a manifest victory. Ibn Kathir has quoted Ibn Abbas, who says that you consider the conquering of Mecca to be the victory, while the victory for us is the treaty conducted at Hudaybiyah. Why? Because people were able to come into Islam. إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسِ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. That when the victory and help of Allah Ta'ala come and you see people entering into the deen in droves, this is what actually we're here to do. This is our purpose. And that's what's being taken away from the people in Xinjiang, is that they're not able to have people learning the deen. They're not able to have people learn the Quran. They're not able to have people develop themselves. This is something scary for us to think about, but it's also something for us to reflect upon, that we have these abilities in the place where we live, so we should take up those means. Next thing is that if we think that the purpose of our life is to become Muslims, does that mean that it stops there? Does that mean that we all become Muslim, we come to the mosque and we pray? And obviously the answer to that is no, because we have the model of the Prophet ﷺ, we have the model of the Sahaba, that in Medina to Munawwara they didn't just pray all day. But the one thing that makes our community dynamic is when, after we fulfill the obligations for ourselves, we reach out into the world around us and we share that blessing, we share that nur. So if you look at the advice that Sayyidina Luqman gives to his son, is the first thing he says is Tawheed. Because if a person doesn't have that perspective, they'll be lost. If a person commits shirk, they're going to put things out of place and they'll have a veil over them. So if somebody seems to think that the purpose in their life is a nationalistic revolution, then I have sad news for you. After every single revolution, there's a saying that we have in history, that revolutions eat their own children. So you look at what happened with Stalin and the Russian Revolution. I told you guys, Lenin, he tried to have these goodwill gestures towards Muslims and other people. And after that revolution, all of those revolutionary people, they killed each other off. They had a huge war. You had purges. You had people who were part of those parties. They had to engage in self-criticism, and they were killed. They killed their own comrades. You had in China, I told you, the Gang of Four. Who was the leader of the Gang of Four? It was Mao Zedong's wife. And she was put in prison for the rest of her life, and everything was blamed upon her. You have these people who they think that this revolution, you know, Bertrand Russell, famous British philosopher, he said that if you look at Marxism, it's really a religion on its own, that Marx is the prophet, the Communist Party is the church, the Day of Judgment is the revolution, and paradise is the utopia. But after these people have a revolution, it's not paradise after that. It's crazy violence. So if we have this shirk that we think the be-all, end-all of our life is to achieve some kind of justice that's unattainable, then we're inevitably going to be disappointed. So the first point that we have to reflect on is Tawheed, that we don't come here to achieve something in this world. Whoever loves this world or anything in this world, I guarantee you that you will leave that which you love. And whoever loves Allah Ta'ala, I guarantee you 100% that you will meet the one that you love. This is what we have to inculcate in our lives, is Tawheed. Second thing is Salah, because that purifies us. This was the second advice that he gave to his son. Allah Ta'ala, he says in the Quran over and over again, وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا زَكَاةَ. The Salah is to purify ourselves, Zakah is to reach out to those around us and to help them out. He says to have prayer for yourself, and then what's the next thing? Enjoin right and forbid wrong. This is what makes us the ummah. That Allah Ta'ala says that you're the greatest ummah that has ever been raised up from mankind, because you enjoin that which is right and you forbid that which is wrong, and you are witnesses to truth. After you enjoin right and forbid wrong, you have to have patience in doing that, because people will oppose you. It's not going to be easy that people just go to China and say, hey, stop oppressing these people, and then it's all going to come to an end. You have to struggle with that. And then finally, you have to be humble, that we recognize that even though we're doing things that are right, we're not set up as to lord over other people, etc., etc. So the point is, we have to look inward, and after we look inward, to look outward, and we meet a balance in that. When we're talking about balance, one interesting thing that makes our community dynamic is the concept of fard ayn and fard kifaya. So we have fard ayn, these are individually responsible duties for us, things that we have to do, like prayer, like zakah, like hajj, all of those things. We're allowed to make those up. If you miss a prayer, you make it up. It's relatively easy. it's, may Allah Ta'ala forgive us, but that's something that you can easily make up. And there's clear set time periods. When it comes to fard kifaya, these are communal obligations. And the key thing to remember about a communal obligation is that if you don't pray your salah, you're liable to be punished by Allah Ta'ala. But if the communal obligation isn't fulfilled by the entire community, every single one of us is liable to face the punishment of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. And this is a scary thought. You can't make up a communal obligation. To give one example of a communal obligation is we have to feed people, make sure nobody starves. If somebody starves to death, how do you make that up? You can't make that up. You can't go to a dead person and then give them food and then, you make things right again. It's something that is a lot more weighty on our shoulders. And finally, it's difficult to discern when something becomes communally obligatory. So at what point is it obligatory for us to do X, Y, Z in Xinjiang? At what point do we have to send money there to feed people? Because we can't send money there. If you send people there, they're going to be arrested and put in jail. And, God knows, maybe some of the people who want to go there, like at the last time I gave this talk, somebody said, is anybody going to Xinjiang? I said, I don't know. And if somebody was, I'd be highly suspicious of that because it's not going to help anybody amongst the Uyghurs. As a matter of fact, when you had those bombings where they threw bombs into a police station, or they're running people down with their cars, or they're cutting people down in the train station, that's what led to the situation they have here. The People's Liberation Army is, forget about armies, they are the largest employer in the world. The largest employer in the world. You're not going to take on the People's Liberation Army with some knives in a train station. And how are killing people in a train station is going to help anybody anyways? That's terrorism. So at what point are we obligated to do what with Western China? This is a difficult thing for us to discern. This is something hard for us to think about. When it comes to communal obligations, we have to preserve religion, life, reason, wealth, and family. My point in mentioning this is that there are so many things going on in the world today that our be-all, end-all of existence isn't just stopping oppression in one area or another. And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit to show how there are parallels to how religion, it's being destroyed in Xinjiang. It's horrible what's happening. But you also have the same thing happening in other places as well, including in the United States. You have Islamophobia, you have other problems here. Preserving life, it's not just being taken in Xinjiang. It's really ironic and sad that you have people in the United States State Department who say that those are concentration camps. Under Mike Pompeo, the State Department has said that Xinjiang has concentration camps filled with 2 million people. But when you have American Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez say that we have concentration camps on the southern border, those same people in that same political party called her an anti-Semite. They say it's anti-Semitic to use that term. The hypocrisy there is, it's astounding. So we have other obligations that we can think about because there's not a whole lot that we can do directly in Xinjiang, but I'm going to talk about some other things we can do. So what can we do about it? Frederick Douglass was another abolitionist. The reason why I want to quote William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass is because these were two people who they dedicated their lives, the greater portion of their life, to freeing slaves. And they actually did it. William Lloyd Garrison dedicated himself to freeing slaves from the age of 20, and that was in 1821. And slaves weren't freed until 1864. If you study their lives, I used to teach American history, the most inspiring chapter, the chapter I used to always love in the textbook that we had, it was chapter 8, and that was the reformers of the Northeast. And you learned about people who they tried to ban alcohol, they tried to give women's rights, William Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. You had these people who they worked their whole lives and they never gave up, and they were able to see some results. In the case of William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. they died before they could vote, but what they did, it changed the world after them. As a matter of fact, it's illustrative that in 1848, you had two conferences in the world. You had, number one, the publication of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. It's an amazing book. If you read it, I had to read it in college, you will feel when you put that book down like you're going to punch somebody in the face. It's one of the most amazing pieces of rhetoric a person can ever read. But after 1848, everybody picked up weapons. They had revolutions in Europe, and then you had counter-revolutions, and a bunch of people died. Nothing really changed. In 1848, in a small village in New York called Seneca Falls, you had a group of women gathered together in an old church, and they had their first women's rights convention. And if you look at the achievements of the women's rights group that was kicked off in 1848 compared to Karl Marx and the International Communist Party, there are also achievements there too. It's not like they were all just evil communists who want to destroy the world. You have the 8-hour workday, that was the product of those people. Minimum wage was the product of those people. Having time off, like Labor Day and weekends, that was a product of those people. Workers' compensation was a product of, these people were advocating for laborers' rights. But if you compare that to women's rights have come so far that long-term approach has a lot more results to it. But anyways, Frederick Douglass, he was talking about, he prayed 20 years for freedom from slavery, but nothing happened until he started praying with his legs. And that's when he ran away. So you have to take up the means also, is what it means. General reflections, I already talked about that. We should be involved, etc., etc. The Ashab al-Kahf, it's interesting to note, they were in their cave for 300 years, and then when they came out, society had changed. How did that society change? Whenever I read that story, today's Friday, we read Surah al-Kahf, right? I always wonder, how did that society change over the course of those 300 years? But we have the blueprint for how to change society. It's called the Seerah of Rasulullah sallam. He changed his society in 23 years. It's more amazing than that. So these people, though, what they did is Allah Ta'ala, He brought them together on faith. They remained united on that. He strengthened their heart. They spoke the truth, and then they became an example to their people. All right. So what can be done about the Uyghur situation? There's 3 approaches that you'll hear people talking about. The first one is a confluence of interests. What you see in this picture is right here in the center. You have Rabia Kadir. She was the 2nd president of the World Uyghur Congress. And she's meeting with George W. Bush during his presidency in front of the White House because she was trying to gather support for Uyghurs against communist China. So this is a confluence of interests where we have people in the right-wing United States who want to oppose China, they want to bring down China, and they might be able to use the Uyghurs as a way to do that. So this is something that some people have tried to use as a way to open things up so that they can get help, so that they can help people in Xinjiang get their rights. And this has been influential, like I said. The World Uyghur Congress has been able to push through legislation in the United States with Marco Rubio. It's coming through now, the Human Rights Act for Uyghurs in 2019. And they're able to get things done in terms on that front. Another type of action that we have is a common sense call to action. So anybody knows the person on the left, inshallah, is Dr. Hatem Bazian. He's a lecturer at UC Berkeley and Zaytuna College. And on the right is Noam Chomsky. And there's a letter that you guys can read online. It's a statement by concerned scholars in Xinjiang. And they make a basic common sense call to action that, number 1, we expedite asylum seekers who are from Xinjiang so that they can come to the United States and be safe. Number 2, sanctions on the Communist Party leaders in Xinjiang and also the Communist Party leader in China, Xi Jinping, so that they will be sanctioned so they can't do what they're doing in China to the Uyghurs. You also have other plans, like for instance, universities, and this is something for student activists, if your university has a partnership with a Chinese university, to bring this up, that you're concerned about the Uyghurs, and then you might cut off those types of research grants, etc., to put pressure on the PRC, the People's Republic of China. And then a third way could be solidarity. This is David Bromby. He's a professor in Sydney, Australia, and he's called for a third way. Number 1 is you want to internationalize this conflict to make it an anti-racist conflict. The fact is that in Xinjiang now, 50% of the people there are not Uyghurs. About 40 to 50% are Han Chinese. And if there's going to be any reconciliation in Xinjiang, so there's no more racial violence, so there's no more problems there, it's going to have to be, you're going to have to bring in the Han Chinese. And the way to do that is to frame the struggle as an anti-racist struggle, that Uyghur people are being held down, they're being racially discriminated against. The People's Republic of China, as a leftist-oriented political group, they are in name, at least, against racism. So this is one way that you could frame it. Something else is Islamophobia. What's interesting is a lot of the things that they're doing in China, you have the same things happening in Western countries. In France, they're banning Muslim dress, or they're banning religious symbols, but we all know it's Muslim dress, and particularly for the sisters. As a matter of fact, just a couple weeks ago, they had public pools for people because it was so hot in France, and Muslim women wanted to go wearing a Muslim swimsuit, and they shut down the entire pool. You have some people in France, charities, that they want to serve food to homeless people in France that contains pork in it or a little bit of alcohol to make sure Muslims don't get that food. You have people in Switzerland, they want to ban minarets. One thing that China has done in Xinjiang is they start demolishing the mosques, they take off the domes, they take off the minarets. They want people in Switzerland and other places to force immigrants who are coming to their country to shake hands with someone of the opposite gender as a type of religious test to make sure you're not an extremist. They want them to watch videos of different types of couples kissing each other to make sure they're not religious extremists. They have all these similar types of tests that they have in China, but they're being done in Western countries. You have people in this country who call for similar types of actions. There's many examples of this in Quebec. Also in the United States, our president is retweeting some of the videos of these groups in Europe who are calling for these things. So you internationalize the conflict against Islamophobia. And then also against war, saying we don't want to have an imperialist war where Western nations can tear apart China like they did before. We're also against that. For solidarity, for dignity, for basic human rights. These are the things that you can build a movement upon in order to support people in China. So those are three typical ways. Most Uyghur people, it seems like, and I feel almost, I was saying to one of the brothers, I feel kind of ashamed almost being up here speaking about this when I'm not Uyghur, when I don't speak the language. So forgive me for doing that, but this is just three approaches that some people are taking. Parallel struggles. In the United States, we have concentration camps and family separations going on our southern border. We have people who are died. We have 10 children who've died in the last few years. Before these last few years of Donald Trump's policy, we haven't had a single child die in this country in immigration detention for 10 years. So we have something similar happening in our country that we can work on. Mass incarceration. The United States, we incarcerate more people than China has. And we know our justice system, like I said, in New York, they're rounding up people of color just on that basis of fulfilling quotas. So we have a similar struggle to take place in this country right now. That's something we can directly act upon. You have indigenous and Native American rights. The same way that Uyghurs are having their land taken, you had children in Indian families who were taken away and they were forced to assimilate on reservations and in schools that basically were designed to make them white. Environmental degradation, just like how there's desertification taking place in China, we have environmental degradation taking place in this country. Physical and psychological torture. There's other pictures that I could have put up here, but we're in a masjid and I can't, where the United States is partaking in torturing people physically and psychologically as well. That's something that we can act upon. And then you also have this idea of capacity building. This is the former Soviet Union. One thing that was interesting about the former Soviet Union is once its control collapsed on Muslim countries, Islam was so ingrained in these ethnic groups that the da'wah, it just skyrocketed. Capacity building is a kind of buzzword amongst non-governmental organizations, but the idea here is that they have to be able to have da'wah ready so that these countries can incorporate teaching and learning in a safe way that's not tainted with terrorism or terrorist groups, so that Islam can flourish in these places once the control over Xinjiang releases and people can practice their religion. And then we have the final concept of inverted totalitarianism. This is a bird cage with the cage open. Because in China, people don't have access to information. It's a traditional totalitarian state. Whereas in the United States, we have a different situation where they don't need to ban books. They don't need to ban information because people are so busy entertaining themselves. You know, I always say watching grown men get paid millions of dollars to play a child's game on television, right? They're so busy doing these things that they're not going to read books. So we have something that some sociologists called inverted totalitarianism, where instead of having the government take our information, we sign it off, our privacy, when we sign on to Facebook or to Google or whatever the case may be. So this is something for us to recognize that these people are being forced out of the mosques. We're just not going because we're lazy. And that's it. You guys have any questions? Yeah? Jazakallah.
If anyone has any questions, I'll pass the mic to you if you want to ask about the history of all that you went over. I know there's a lot of information, but if anyone has any questions, I would like to ask Brother Thomas, and before we close up.
I mean, in China overall. Yeah. What percentage are the Muslims in China overall?
So what percentage is it? That's a simple fact. One thing I tried to do with the presentation is that there's a lot of documentary, like BBC has a great documentary, Vice News has a great documentary, and they'll give you stats like that. What I mostly want to do with this is to give you the story maybe a little bit more holistic with the Chinese perspective too. Why are they doing what they're doing? So, you know, China has 1 billion people in it. You have the Hui Muslims, they're about 10 million. In Xinjiang, how many Uyghurs are there? this is also something that people, they don't really know exactly. Because they say, like, we're having this census fight in the United States, right, over the citizenship question, because the government wants to lowball how many people are in certain states so they don't have to give them funds. Same thing happens in China. So they have a census, but it's being controlled by the government, so you're not really sure how many people are there. So I was talking with one sister who is from China. She's a Hui Muslim. And she was saying how if you just look at the birth rates and you compare it to the census years ago, there has to be way more Muslims in China than what China actually says. But you can't really know. So you could go and find the government statistic, but it's not really going to be accurate, most likely.
Anyone else would like to question? I know we're getting close to something from the kids haven't. So, because of the adhan's going to happen, but right now, Qiyaf Salah is in 10 minutes. So obviously, maybe you guys could approach him directly, inshallah ta'ala. I want to just kind of reiterate what he mentioned is that if you ever go to YouTube and you put Uyghur Muslims in it, the BBC document comes up, what I think was very good. I watched it myself. Goes in. They actually let them go in the cameras and go into the concentration camps, so you actually get to see exactly what's going on. And Vice has one. All of them will come up on that YouTube list if you do there. I really urge you to look at that because it kind of puts faces to all the information that he just said. At the end, we'd like to thank Ustaz Thomas. May Allah reward you and bless you for your knowledge. He definitely knows the information very well. A lot of names, a lot of dates, a lot of information. But like I said, if you have questions, you can approach him after the adhan or after the program. May Allah bless you and reward you, inshallah ta'ala, and bless all of you. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help our brothers and sisters in Western China and free them and give them victory. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah.